Political Ponerology, Paraphrased. Original book by Andrew Lobaczewski. Preface by the editor of this AI paraphrased edition. For decades I have been on a quest to try to understand the nature of human evil. I have gone in many directions and turned over many stones. Underneath one of those stones was this book, Political Ponerology. I consider this work to be essential reading on the subject of collective evil. The author lays out an extremely detailed and, I believe, very well-founded case that the health of societies and their rise and fall is closely linked to the influence of psychological deviants of the type we would now call cluster B or dark triad personality types. In other words, psychopaths and related types of individuals. I share the author's view that our civilization is catastrophically vulnerable to the influence of these types because of our general lack of psychological knowledge, including specialized language that focuses directly on the problem of psychopathy. As a Jungian who has deeply pursued the subject of the shadow, I am also aware that psychopaths are not the primary cause of human evil. As I understand it, evil is a function of the structure of the human psyche and our inbuilt need to externally displace our primal and antisocial drives into the world and onto each other through psychological projection. Psychopaths, it seems to me, serve as triggering agents who facilitate the movement of shadow energy in people who are totally unconscious of their own shadows and have a need to offload this caustic energy. Psychopaths, especially when gathered into positions of influence, are energized to serve as the matadors who direct the attention of our inner beasts towards the direction they wish to take it. But ultimately, it is we who end up getting sliced up. I agree with the author's general proposition that we need a new science focused on this macro-social problem and that general psychological literacy is badly needed. But my view on this is also in line with that of Carl Jung and his colleague Erich Neumann, who looked forward to a psycho-spiritual public movement focused on inner development and the conscious integration of our own shadows, what Jung called individuation. This type of personal inner work actually produces the highest level of immunity to psychopaths and the proliferation of evil. I recommend Neumann's book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, which I have also produced a paraphrased edition of. The reason for this paraphrase of Political Ponerology, which was created with the help of an AI program, is because the text is very dense and the language difficult to comprehend, even for those with psychological training. I have tried to preserve the full theoretical framework while compressing the original to roughly a fifth of its length. Please excuse any errors in the audio version due to limitations in AI voice technology. The edition this paraphrase is based on is the first Red Pill press release from 2007. There is now a 2022 release with an improved translation and extras. I encourage you to obtain a physical copy for all the added depth it contains and keep it in your library. Colin Davis, shadowtechalchemy.com. Forward. This book has an unusual history that the reader should know before going further. It is the work of a Polish clinical psychologist named Andrew Lobaczewski, and he wrote it 3 times. The first manuscript he threw into a coal furnace minutes before the secret police arrived to search his apartment. The second he handed to an American tourist to carry out of Poland and deliver to a senior figure at the Vatican. He never learned what became of it. The third version, finished in New York in 1984, is the one you are about to read. From the day he completed that draft until the day it was finally published in English, more than 20 years passed. People do not lose 2 drafts of an ordinary academic book. Governments do not work to suppress one either. The reason has to do with what the book is actually about. Lobachevsky belonged to a network of Polish and Hungarian researchers, mostly psychologists and psychiatrists, who lived through the Nazi occupation and then through Stalinism. They could see on a daily clinical basis that something had happened to their societies that could not be explained by ordinary political or sociological language. Decisions were being made and policies enforced that no person of conscience would have made or enforced. Whole institutions had been seized by something with a recognizable shape, but no one had given that shape a name. Quietly and at considerable risk, these researchers began to study the phenomenon as if it were a disease. Their starting point was simple. If you cannot explain how a nation comes to behave the way Nazi Germany behaved, or the way Stalin's Soviet Union behaved by appeal to ideology alone, then maybe the missing piece is psychiatric. Maybe certain personality types, when concentrated in positions of power, change the character of the institutions they occupy. Maybe the rest of the population is then drawn, by mechanisms that can be described and studied, into a pattern of compliance and self-deception that cannot be undone by ordinary political argument. The researchers gave themselves a long task. They wanted to identify those personality types, describe how they behave in groups, explain how they capture institutions, and chart the predictable stages by which a healthy society becomes a sick one. The work was secret because it had to be. A communist regime cannot tolerate the suggestion that its character is best understood as a clinical condition. Researchers suspected of that line of thinking risked imprisonment or worse. Lobachevsky worked in obscurity in the Polish countryside, well away from the universities, and exchanged data with collaborators whose names were withheld from him for safety. The plan was that another scientist, kept anonymous, would assemble the final synthesis. That synthesis never happened. In the early 1960s, after the wave of post-Stalin repression, the network was broken. Its members were arrested, scattered, silenced, or killed. Lobachevsky was left holding fragments of a much larger project. Over the following years, working alone, he tried to weld those fragments into a coherent whole, filling the gaps with his own clinical research. His particular contribution, beyond preserving what could be preserved, was to propose a name for the new field this body of work pointed toward. He called it Ponerology, from the Greek word for evil. Ponerology, as he understood it, would study the genesis of evil in human societies the way pathology studies the genesis of disease in human bodies. It would be a clinical science, not a moral or theological one, and its goal would be to make the patterns visible enough that they could be recognized in time. When he finally reached the West, he expected the work would find an audience. It did not. He learned, painfully, that the Soviet apparatus had a long reach in the United States, and that the same instinct to suppress this material existed there, even if it operated more quietly. Editors found polite reasons to decline. Psychology editors said it was too political. Political editors said it was too psychological. Deadlines were always already passed. He was the third emissary, he later learned, to bring this kind of knowledge to America. The other two had been similarly handled. He took manual labor to survive, and his health collapsed. The manuscript sat for 2 decades. It was rescued, finally, when Lobachevsky was contacted by a small research group in the West who had been working through similar questions about psychopathy in modern public life. They published the book essentially as he had written it in 1984. He was by then a very old man. He acknowledged in his final preface that the surviving text was not what the original synthesis would have been. Most of the case data was gone. What remained was the framework, plus enough clinical detail to make the framework comprehensible. He asked future readers to take the work forward, to fill in the gaps, and to put it to use. That last request matters. The book is not meant as a finished science. It is meant as the surviving outline of one. The author makes the point with a Latin medical maxim he uses as his motto, ignota nulla curatio morbi, which translates roughly as,
Do not try to cure what you do not understand. His claim throughout the book is that humanity has tried over and over to cure macrosocial evil without first having a clinical description of what the disease actually is. Moral exhortation, military force, regime change, ideological reform. All of these, he argues, will fail or backfire if the practitioners do not first understand the underlying pathology. What is that pathology? In broad terms, the book argues that a small fraction of any population, perhaps 1 in 20, has a personality structure that lacks the inner emotional faculties most people take for granted. They feel no genuine guilt. They form no real bonds. They experience other human beings primarily as objects to be used. The research literature has had many names for this condition over the years, including psychopathy, sociopathy, and antisocial personality disorder. And these terms do not all mean the same thing. Lobachevsky uses several of them with care, and one of his early tasks in the book is to clean up the vocabulary so that the different conditions can be told apart. The most important type for his purposes he calls the essential psychopath. This person is not necessarily violent and is often charming, intelligent, and successful by ordinary measures. The defining feature is not visible criminal behavior, but an inner emptiness where the moral life of a normal person would be. Lobachevsky's argument is that when essential psychopaths and a few related personality types reach high positions in government or other powerful institutions, and especially when they can recruit one another, they do not merely cause harm in the ordinary sense. They change the institutions themselves. The institutions begin to operate on the logic of the personality type that has captured them. The rest of the population, being normal, struggles to understand what is happening because normal people instinctively assume that other people are like themselves. That assumption is the central vulnerability the book wants to expose. Once a sufficient number of normal people surrender it, the pattern can be seen, and once it can be seen, it can be resisted intelligently. The chapters that follow take the reader step by step through the components of this picture. They describe the personality types involved, the social conditions under which they spread, the predictable phases by which a healthy society slides into pathology, and the conditions under which recovery becomes possible. The book is uneven in places because the original drafts that contained much of the supporting data are lost. It uses some terms in ways that may be unfamiliar even to readers with a psychology background. The present version is a contemporary paraphrase intended to make the argument accessible without softening its substance. A final note. Lobachevsky wrote this book under conditions that almost guaranteed it would not survive. Those who shared the work with him faced worse. Whatever the reader's verdict on the theory, the book is, at minimum, a record of an attempt to look honestly at something most people of that time did not want to see. The effort was costly. It would be a shame to read it cheaply. Chapter 1, Introduction. Lobachevsky opens with a memory from his student years. It is the late 1940s in post-war Poland. He and his classmates, finishing their psychology degrees, are required to attend a new course of ideological lectures. The lecturer is a stranger. No one knows where he came from. His speech is fluent, but it is not a scientific lecture. He blurs the line between scientific concepts and ordinary opinion, treats his own biases as obvious truth, and looks at the students with poorly hidden contempt. Laughing or arguing back would be dangerous, so the students sit through 90 minutes a week in silence. What they experience during these lectures is more disturbing than boredom. Something feels wrong inside them. The ordinary fabric of moral judgment, friendship, and patriotism begins to feel slippery and unreal, as though wrapped in a chilly fog. Afterward, they ask each other in whispers whether the others felt it too. They learn to protect themselves with weekend trips to the mountains, with company and laughter and deep sleep, and most of all by analyzing the lecturer's personality. Treating the lecturer as a clinical specimen turns out to be the best psychological hygiene available to them. That observation stays with Lobachevsky for the rest of his life. He is also struck by something else. About 6% of his classmates do not merely sit through the lectures uncomfortably. They change. Their worldview shifts. Their language begins to echo the lecturer's. Friendly arguments stop reaching them. They take on the tone of people who have access to a hidden knowledge that their old friends lack. They join the party. Lobachevsky calls this process transpersonification and notes that the colleagues who underwent it came from every kind of background, including aristocratic and devout religious families. Whatever made them susceptible was not social class or upbringing. It was something inside them. The remaining 94% did not transform, but most of them did suffer some level of damage to their personalities and had to do private work afterward to find themselves again. From this experience, Lobachevsky takes away two convictions that will shape the rest of his career. The first is that the people running the system know what they are doing in psychological terms. The lecturer was bait. He was casting for a specific kind of person, and he knew how to catch them. The second conviction is that this knowledge, while currently a tool of conquest, could in principle be turned around. If it became ordinary public science, nations could develop a kind of immunity to it. Before going further, Lobachevsky insists on a particular stance, which he calls the naturalist stance. He recalls a story he read as a youth about a biologist in the Amazon. A small animal fell from a tree onto the back of the biologist's neck, broke his skin, and began to drink his blood. The biologist removed the creature carefully, without anger, and then studied it. That, Lobachevsky says, is the right attitude to take toward what fell on his nation. Not approval, not detachment from suffering, but a refusal to let revulsion override the desire to understand. A scientific curiosity, calmly maintained even in the middle of horror, is what makes useful work possible. He then makes a sharp argument against a certain kind of literature. Many books exist that describe the horrors of the 20th century. Memoirs from the camps, accounts of the gulags, autobiographies of mass murderers like the commandant of Auschwitz. He names Kostler, Solzhenitsyn, and others. These books matter. They preserve evidence, but they cannot on their own explain how such horrors come to be. A vivid description of a disease, however accurate and moving, is not the same as an etiology. It does not tell you why the disease started or how to treat it. The library of horror is enormous, but the shelf that should hold the explanation is empty. This book is meant to fill that gap. The reason no one has filled it before is partly a problem of language. Ordinary language, what he calls natural language, was developed for ordinary life. It carries unstated moral assumptions and emotional reflexes. It is not built to describe the kind of phenomena that a clinical psychologist sees in mass political violence. Even the conventional language of social science is not enough, since it tends to soften critical judgments and treat ethical questions as if they were beside the point. To do this work properly, the author argues, one must reach for the vocabulary of biology, psychology, and especially psychopathology, even if it feels strange to apply such terms to political life. Doing so will require the reader to set aside an instinct Lobachevsky calls natural egotism. Most people assume that other people are basically like themselves, with similar inner lives and similar motivations. That assumption is the central blind spot the book wants to expose. As long as it stands, certain kinds of human beings can hide in plain sight, and certain political phenomena will remain unintelligible. The chapters ahead, the author tells the reader, will move step by step. First will come basic concepts about human personality and society, framed in a way that fits the experience of a working clinician. Next will come the central chapter on Ponerology, which describes the genesis of evil at every social scale. Later chapters will examine what the author calls pathocracy, the macrosocial form these processes take when essential psychopathy reaches the levers of state power. The final chapters will ask what can be done. The medical framing is more than decorative. The author closes by arguing that the methods used to confront macrosocial evil have, until now, resembled medieval medicine, bleeding the patient, wars and counter-wars, propaganda and counter-propaganda. What he wants to propose instead is something closer to modern antibiotics, or better, a course of carefully administered psychotherapy. The aim is to heal a society, not destroy it. And the rule that governs all of it is the Latin medical maxim he uses as his motto. Do not try to cure what you do not understand. Chapter 2, Some Indispensable Concepts. Lobachevsky opens with a historical claim about Western civilization. 3 streams fed it: Greek philosophy, Roman law and administration, and Christianity. Each strand had strengths, but the combination left the culture thin in one specific area. Roman law treated human beings as legal abstractions because complicated psychological realities only get in the way of efficient administration. Christianity arrived with deep psychological insight, especially in its first 3 centuries, but in adapting itself to Rome, it inherited Roman habits of legal thinking and lost much of that depth. The civilization that emerged was strong in law and theology, but unusually weak in its understanding of the human person. That weakness, Lobachevsky argues, is more than a cultural curiosity. It is a defense vulnerability. A civilization that lacks a precise psychological vocabulary cannot describe certain kinds of evil, even when those kinds of evil are operating openly. Hyperactive individuals with an inner sense of being different can find a ready echo in the unconscious of a population that has no language for what is happening. What such individuals dream of imposing on others, in a psychologically literate society, they could never get away with. In a psychologically illiterate one, they often succeed. This chapter introduces the conceptual tools the rest of the book depends on. Its 4 sections cover the discipline of psychology, the difference between ordinary language and objective scientific language, the structure of the human individual, and the structure of society. Psychology, the discipline of modern psychology, was launched in the 1870s as a secular project rooted in biology and medicine. Because it grew out of the material sciences, it was at first one-sided. The older traditions of psychological wisdom in religion and philosophy were largely set aside. Pavlov, Jung, and others recognized this and tried to put the picture back together, but for political reasons, Pavlov was not allowed to publish his actual views. Psychology has a problem no other science has. The observer and the observed are the same species, and sometimes the same person. Distance between them is not given. Subjective error can creep in unnoticed and produce vicious circles in the analyst's reasoning. The behaviorists tried to solve this by ruthlessly excluding everything subjective. The cost was that very little psychological substance was left, but it produced a useful discipline of thought. Practical clinical work, the daily experience of therapists with real patients in real conditions, has done more to build a working scientific language than laboratory experiment ever could. Life itself runs experiments on people that no laboratory would ever sanction. This book, the author notes, is the product of one such involuntary experiment, conducted on entire nations. A working psychologist learns over time to track another person's life history quickly, to identify the conditions that shape their personality, even when the person is not aware of those conditions. To do this, the psychologist relies less and less on the everyday concepts of common sense and more on a clinical conceptual language. That language often becomes shop talk rather than disciplined science, but it is the right tool for the job. It functions a little like mathematical notation. A single symbol stands for many pages of operation that the trained mind reads at a glance. Objective language. Why is ordinary language not enough?
because every person's natural worldview, no matter how refined by literature and reflection, is shaped by the species' instincts and by the accidents of upbringing. It carries reliable wisdom in some areas and reliable distortion in others. Lobachevsky lists the main distortions. First, our emotional reflexes are never quite tuned to reality. Religious and philosophical traditions have always counseled mastering them for this reason. Second, the natural worldview tends to deliver moral judgment automatically, often in the form of outrage. When we see another person behave badly, we leap to a verdict about their character rather than asking what psychological conditions might be driving them. This reflex is especially destructive when the bad behavior is being driven by a clinical anomaly the observer does not know how to recognize. The judge, in such cases, is almost always wrong. Third, the natural worldview is not universal. A small percentage of people in any society have a worldview that is different in kind, not just in degree, and the natural worldview cannot reach them. Fourth, like Euclidean geometry, the natural worldview works for ordinary middle-scale cases. It breaks down at extremes. When otherwise sensible people overestimate the reach of their natural worldview, treating it as if it were a sufficient instrument for judging anything human, Lobachevsky calls this the egotism of the natural worldview. Until recently, this egotism was relatively harmless. Today, when phenomena exist that cannot be described in natural language at all, it becomes dangerous. It blocks the very kind of objective response that could help. What is needed instead is an objective psychological language built on biological reality, methodologically continuous with medicine and the other natural sciences. Building such a language is not the work of any single scientist. It accumulates through the contributions of many. The clinical concepts in this book are an early entry in that project. There is a personal cost to making the shift. Researchers who started out trying to understand macrosocial evil in ordinary social science terms went through a period of frustration and crisis when they realized their hypotheses, however reasonable in normal conceptual language, were simply not true to the facts. Many never made it through the crisis. Those who did had to live for a while with what philosophers call nescience, an honest awareness of not yet knowing. The reader of this book, the author warns, will go through a milder version of the same experience. Some of the natural language assumptions one brings in will not survive contact with the material. The human individual underneath. The human personality lies what Lobachevsky calls the instinctive substratum. It is the inheritance we share in modified form with the rest of the animal kingdom. In humans, this substratum has become less rigid and more plastic, ceding some of its dictatorial role to reason, but retaining its rich content. It is what makes intuition of other people possible, what generates the feel for another person's psychological state, what allows the formation of social bonds and the recognition of moral values. Our instinct, he says, is our first tutor, and we carry it inside us all our lives. Soviet ideology, he notes, accepted human descent from animals as part of its materialism, but tried to suppress all serious study of the instinctive heritage that descent implies, because such study would expose too much. The substratum is not perfect. It carries millions of years of trial and error built into emotional reflexes that sometimes serve us and sometimes mislead us. One particular reflex matters greatly for this book. We are wired to want to suppress anyone who threatens us or our group, but our instinct does not distinguish between someone behaving badly out of ordinary human weakness and someone behaving badly because of a clinical pathology. In fact, we tend to judge the second kind more harshly than the first, in obedience to a deep biological drive to remove the defective. That tendency is itself one of the engines by which evil is generated in human affairs, and the book will return to it. Built on the instinctive substratum is the rest of the personality. Memory holds life experience. Association builds connections. Reasoning develops over a lifetime.
peaking when the heat of instinct has begun to cool. A function unique to humans, what he calls internal projection, or simply introspection, allows the person to set imagined material in the field of attention and inspect it. Used on oneself, it makes monitoring one's own personality possible. People differ widely on every one of these dimensions. The distribution of these differences is not flat. The higher the species in psychological organization, Lobachevsky observes, the wider the variation between individuals, and humans show the widest variation of any species. Most people have a healthy, instinctive substratum and ordinary basic intelligence. A small minority show what he calls morbid phenomena, mental deviations and anomalies that are not abnormal in the sense that genius is statistically abnormal, but qualitatively different from normal in a way that affects everyone around them. These deviations are usually mild enough to be hidden, but they slip easily into the long process by which evil is generated and spread. Tracking them, he insists, is not optional for anyone trying to understand this book. The 4th chapter will lay out the full typology. The point at this stage is simply that they exist, that they matter, and that the natural language tendency to moralize them, to call them bad rather than describe them clinically, is precisely what allows them to keep doing damage. One more term he introduces in passing should be flagged here, since it recurs throughout the book. Conversive thinking is the use of familiar words while quietly inverting or twisting their meaning, calling appeasement peacefulness, calling license freedom, calling a mob a rally. The form looks normal. The content has been bent. Society, humans are wired to be social. The mind cannot develop without other minds, and the personality cannot form without inheritance from those who lived before, contact with those alive now, and concern for those still to come. Hedonistic isolation makes people lose themselves. The relationship between an individual and their society resembles the relationship between a bee and its hive, only superficially. A casual observer of either watches a crowd of similar units bumping around. A beekeeper, watching the hive, sees a body of laws at work that the casual observer misses. A psychologist of society does the same with a city. Social life follows laws of its own, laws that long predate any particular city and will outlast it. People who refuse to recognize those laws and try to read society as a sum of independent individuals have a hard time understanding what they see. 2 things especially shape the health of a society. The first is the quality of its psychological vocabulary. The richer and more accurate the concepts that ordinary people have at their disposal for thinking about themselves and others, the more capable the society is of self-government and of making sense of other nations. A society could in principle be measured on this dimension. Lobachevsky imagines a kind of inventory test administered to representative groups, producing an indicator of the society's psychological literacy. The indicator would also be a leading indicator of political stability. The second is the quality of fit between people and the social roles they hold. When the most talented are in the positions that require their talents, society reaps the benefit and the individual feels what he experiences as justice. When circumstances force capable people into roles too small for them, what Lobachevsky calls downward adjustment, those people feel cheated. Their thoughts wander into fantasies of a fairer world, and revolutionary or radical ideologies find willing recruits among them. When the opposite happens, what he calls upward adjustment, people from privileged origins or favored political groups occupy positions beyond their actual abilities. Those people learn to avoid serious problems, to perform competence rather than exercise it, and to attack and remove anyone more capable. They tend, Lobachevsky observes, to favor whip-cracking, totalitarian governments that protect their unearned positions. Both kinds of misadjustment waste a society's most basic resource, its talent. Together they predict, with some reliability, whether a country is heading toward gradual reform or sudden revolution. There is a third feature of society the book will return to in later chapters. In any population, people whose psychology developed improperly tend to find each other. They form a network, weakly connected to the main social structure, but strongly connected to themselves. From this network arise dreams of taking power, and sometimes those dreams come true. The book will spend considerable time tracking how this network operates. Two smaller observations close the chapter. Very large countries suffer from what Lobachevsky calls macropathy, a kind of giant sickness in which the central government is too far from local life for human reason to reach across the distance, and rule by regulation replaces rule by judgment. Society itself, he insists, is neither a body whose cells exist for the whole, nor a colony of insects driven by collective instinct. It is a complex weave of individuals, the most variegated of any species, and trying to model it as if its members were equal in the relevant sense is bad science. Equality before the law is unequal under the law of nature, and a serious psychology of society has to face that. The chapter ends with a beekeeper analogy. When a hive's queen fails to mate in time, she begins laying only unfertilized eggs, which produce only drones. The hive's instinct continues to defend her. In time, the worker generation dies out, and the colony collapses, and only outside intervention can save it. The beekeeper has to find and remove the failed queen, install a new fertilized one, and accept being stung in the process. The question Lobachevsky poses, and that the rest of the book is built around, is whether the human hive can come to understand its own version of this disease in time, and whether it can learn to administer the remedy itself rather than waiting for an external beekeeper to do it. Chapter 3. The Hystoroidal Cycle. This is a short chapter, but it sets up a central historical claim of the book. Lobachevsky argues that human societies oscillate between what he calls good times and bad times, and that the oscillation is not random. It is driven by a predictable psychological mechanism that operates across generations. The cycle begins with the human longing for ease. People want peace and prosperity and the chance to enjoy what earlier generations built. There is nothing wrong with the wish, but in its hedonistic form, it carries the seed of its own collapse. In good times, the mental work that built the good times begins to seem like a waste of effort. Why study human nature, your own or anyone else's, when life is going well? Why ponder the laws of existence when the goods of existence appear to be available for the taking? Reflection becomes the habit of cranks. Predicting trouble is the habit of killjoys. Cleverness, sociability, and a light touch are the public virtues, and the search for truth becomes a kind of bad manners. The result, over time, is what Lobachevsky calls the hysterical state of a society. He uses hysterical in a particular sense, not the popular one. He means a fear of inconvenient truth, a reflex avoidance of anything that would disturb the comfortable surface. In a society in this state, uncomfortable facts get screened out before they reach awareness. Reasoning happens on the basis of trimmed information, which can never produce sound conclusions. Inconvenient premises get unconsciously replaced by convenient ones. Thinking is literally bent. The vocabulary follows. People begin substituting the meanings of words to flatter themselves and protect their illusions, which is the conversive thinking introduced in the previous chapter showing up at scale. Once the pattern has hardened, two things follow. The capacity for moral reasoning weakens, because moral reasoning depends on accurate perception of what is actually happening, and the ability of pathological individuals to influence the public mind grows. Lobachevsky has not yet given the typology of those individuals, which comes in Chapter 4, but the point here is that they do not need to take a society by force. A psychologically literate population can recognize them and resist them. A psychologically illiterate population, after a few generations of softening, cannot. The pathological individuals find each other, build networks, and weave their ideologies of overcompensation into the public conversation. The good old days, in retrospect, are the years in which the next catastrophe was incubated. Bad times, when they come, do something useful in spite of everything. The pressure of difficulty forces people to think clearly again. They have to distinguish one human personality from another in order to survive. They have to recognize their adversaries accurately. Long-buried capacities of judgment come back into use, and virtues that had been mere literary motifs regain their substance. This is why, Lobachevsky argues, bad times are not only the consequence of the cycle, but in some sense its corrective. They rebuild what the good times eroded. He notes a teleological dimension here, a sense that the cycle has a purpose beyond its mechanism, even if a sufficient philosophical account of that purpose has not yet been given. The chapter then offers a specific historical example. He calls it Austrian talk, after the late Habsburg style of evasive, paralogistic conversation that European observers identified at the time. The phrase passed into several European languages as a label for this kind of speech. The peak of European historization, in his reading, fell around 1900. The First World War broke out into a society already softened by decades of this pattern. Young officers in Vienna sang in the streets about how lovely the war would be. The same regression produced the Russian Revolution, the rise of fascism and Hitlerism, and the Second World War. Underneath those events, screening and disguising the deeper cycle, there developed the macro-social phenomenon the rest of the book is about. He also offers, more cautiously, an observation about the United States in the late 20th century. Writing in 1984, he sees patterns in American public life that older Europeans recognize from the Europe of their youth. Dominance of emotion over reason, litigation and offense-taking serving the cultural function that dueling once did. United fronts of mediocre or incompetent people closing ranks against the talented in universities and politics and business, the word overeducated used as an insult. He predicts that America's most acute social difficulties will arrive about a decade after the first signs of climbing out of the psychological trough, since the worst tensions are usually delayed reactions to causes already in motion. Not all of his predictions have aged equally, and the reader can decide which the present moment confirms or revises. The general shape of the diagnosis is what matters. The cycles Lobachevsky estimates run roughly 2 centuries from peak to peak in any given civilization, and they do not synchronize across civilizations. The American phase, in his calculation, lags about 80 years behind the European. Modern global communication may, however, begin to interlock the cycles in ways that loosen the grip of any one of them, since pressures from civilizations in different phases will start crossing borders that were once impervious. That, plus the steady accumulation of objective psychological knowledge, is where the author locates his hope. The eternal cycle is not actually eternal if the species can come to understand it well enough to interrupt it. The chapter ends by pointing toward what such an understanding would require, and by promising in the next chapter to lay out the new scientific discipline that could provide it. Chapter 4. Ponerology. This is the longest chapter in the book and the most important theoretically. It is where Lobachevsky lays out the typology of personality deviations, explains how those deviations participate in the genesis of evil, and describes how the process scales up from individuals to small groups to entire societies. The framework built here is what the rest of the book applies: the medical analogy and the naming of the field. For most of human history, philosophers and religious thinkers have spent enormous effort describing virtue and almost no equivalent effort describing the genesis of evil. The asymmetry has practical consequences. Imagine, Lobachevsky says, what medicine would look like if physicians had concentrated only on hygiene and treated disease as too unpleasant to study seriously. there would be no modern medicine. The genuine progress of medicine came when researchers were willing to study disease directly, including its causes, its course, and the conditions under which it spreads. The same approach applied to evil would produce something corresponding. Lobachevsky is not the first to notice the analogy, but he proposes a name for the field. Two Greek philologist monks suggested the term Ponerology, from the Greek poneros, evil. The genesis of evil is ponerologesis. The factors that participate in ponerologesis are ponerologesic. His own clinical contribution to this project began with a study of 384 adult patients drawn from a much larger Polish patient pool, all of whom had behaved in ways that seriously hurt others. His finding, which the rest of the chapter builds on, was that something between 84 and 86% of these people showed identifiable psychopathological factors that contributed to what they had done. The finding is not that psychopathological was always the proximate cause, but that some pathological component was almost always present in the synthesis. The natural language tendency to interpret hurtful behavior as a moral matter alone, without reference to clinical factors, leaves out something the data say is almost always there. A general point follows. The deviations that matter most in ponerologists are not the ones that are most obvious clinically. The most active pathological factors are usually mild enough to pass for normal under casual observation, but strong enough to twist the bearer's behavior and to influence the people around them. The rare, dramatic, easily spotted pathologies are less ponerologicentric, active than the quiet, common ones that hide in ordinary social life. Acquired deviations. The first major branch of the typology covers what Lobachevsky calls characterabusing. These are character disorders caused by damage to brain tissue. The damage may be from injury, infection, toxin, or perinatal trauma. Even a small lesion can produce subtle but lasting changes in personality, especially when it occurs in early life. Three kinds matter most for the book. Paranoid characteropy arises typically from damage to the diencephalon, or from being raised by a parent with the same condition. Its bearer reasons fluently and reasonably as long as the conversation does not threaten any of his fixed ideas. As soon as it does, an avalanche of pseudo-logical, often paramoralistic, often insulting argumentation comes down. Cultivated and logical people instinctively avoid the paranoid type. But the paranoid has an unsettling power over less critical minds, especially the young and the resentful. Lobachevsky points to Lenin as a near-pure example, citing the description by Vasily Grossman of a man simultaneously gentle and polite in manner and incapable of granting that any opponent could ever be even slightly right. Frontal characteropy arises from damage to the frontal cortex, particularly when the damage occurs perinatally or in early infancy. The frontal lobes carry the function of internal projection, introduced earlier in the book, which makes self-monitoring possible. When that function is impaired, the person retains intelligence and even charm, but loses the capacity to inspect his own behavior. Lobachevsky describes this kind of personality as marked by overcompensation, infantile emotional control, snake-charming charisma, and irrevocable decisions. The historical example he gives is Stalin, whose photographs, he believes, show the typical forehead deformity associated with very early frontal damage. The portrait of Stalin given by his own daughter, in which someone thrown out of his heart could never be brought back, fits the clinical picture exactly. Drug-induced characteropathies are a more recent development, the product of medications and toxins that damage the nervous system. Some cancer drugs attack the older brain tissue that carries the instinctive substratum and produce a personality shift toward emotional flatness and praise-craving egocentrism. Lobachevsky raises the possibility, without claiming certainty, that the late Shah of Iran's behavior may have had such a component. The crucial point about all the characteropathies is that they spread their effect.
A characteropathic ruler does not simply make bad decisions. The pathologically altered psychological material radiating from him gets absorbed by the population, especially by the young, especially by anyone who identifies with him. A whole generation can grow up with their feel for moral and social reality damaged at second hand. Lobachevsky reads the German nation between Wilhelm II and Hitler as a textbook case. A characteropathic Kaiser produced a generation primed to accept a more dangerous psychopathic leader, and the door was open. Inherited deviations. The second major branch covers conditions that are biologically heritable rather than acquired through damage. Two matter centrally for the book. Schizoidea, sometimes called schizoidal psychopathy, is the older and better known of the two. People with this anomaly are hypersensitive and distrustful, indifferent to other people's feelings, drawn to extreme positions, and prone to retaliate for small offenses. They have a pessimistic view of human nature, which they believe is so bad that order can only be maintained by strong power, exercised by qualified individuals in the name of a higher idea. Lobachevsky calls this typical claim the schizoid declaration, and notes that recognizing it in a writer's work tells the reader something important about the writer.
The danger of the schizoid is mostly intellectual. They are not violent in the ordinary sense, but when their gloomy theories are written down and circulated in large editions, ordinary readers, who have richer psychological worlds and tend to interpret what they read more humanely than the author meant it, miss the underlying flatness of the source. Lobachevsky argues that an analysis of Marx's work along these lines is illuminating. The reader should learn to inspect any disturbingly divisive theoretical work for the schizoid declaration as a kind of warning sign. Essential psychopathy is the centerpiece of the book, and the condition that does the most work in the macrosocial theory. Lobachevsky credits Kazimierz Dabrowski for the term. The condition is rare, around 0.5% of the population in his estimate, though more recent research has put the prevalence higher. It affects both sexes, but is more pronounced in men. Its essence is a deficit not on the sensory level, like colorblindness, but on the instinctive level. Old-school psychiatrists, he reports, used to call essential psychopaths the Daltonists of human feelings and moral values, after the inherited inability to see certain colors. The instinctive substratum of the normal person, introduced in Chapter 2, is what makes most of the social and moral world feel obvious and natural. The essential psychopath is missing pieces of that substratum. The result is not a person who chooses to be cruel, but a person for whom the ordinary moral world is a foreign convention, a system of customs invented by other people, probably by priests, that he cannot quite see the point of. He learns to talk the language of ordinary morality, but it is always for him a second language. When he uses words like love or remorse, he means something different by them than the person hearing him does, even when he is not deliberately deceiving. A few features follow from this. Essential psychopaths are usually somewhat below average in conventional intelligence, though the variation among them is wide. They are not found at the highest levels of intellectual achievement, but they develop, from childhood, a special form of knowledge that normal people lack. They learn to recognize each other in a crowd. They learn that they belong to a different category from everyone else, and they treat the rest of humanity as a different species, observable from a careful distance. They become connoisseurs of normal human weakness, which they then exploit. The suffering they cause inspires no guilt in them, because the suffering belongs to those other people, the not quite conspecific. Harvey Cleckley's Mask of Sanity, an American clinical classic, gave this condition its memorable image. The psychopath wears a perfect performance of normality. From outside, the act is convincing. The deeper deficit, Cleckley argued, is affective. The psychopath has so little real emotional experience that his pseudo-emotion looks the same to him as the real article in others. The three traits clinicians name most often are absence of guilt for harm done, inability to love, and a fluent talkativeness that drifts easily from the truth. Lobachevsky adds two further observations that matter for the macrosocial theory. First, a normal person who has worked closely with essential psychopaths can learn, with effort, to read their conceptual world the way a foreigner learns a difficult language. The reverse is not true. The psychopath can mimic the normal world well enough to get by, but cannot ever inhabit it. Second, the experience of being under the close influence of an essential psychopath is uniquely damaging. Normal people who fall under that influence feel something gnawing at their personality. Their emotions go cold. Their sense of psychological reality is stifled. Some are misdiagnosed by psychiatrists with a manic-depressive crisis, when what they actually have is the wound left by extended exposure to a mind they could not understand. A lighter form of psychopathy, asthenic psychopathy, does not show the full deficit of moral feeling, but produces idealistic, hypersensitive, less intelligent personalities whose visions of a reformed world appeal especially to young rebels and the genuinely wronged. Lobachevsky offers the example of Felix Dzerzewski, the Polish-born revolutionary who founded the Soviet secret police, and his prison cell faith that conditions would change and evil would cease to reign, and man would be a brother to man, an idealism that came from the writer's own difference and that did not protect his future victims. A few other types receive briefer treatment, including the skirtoid, a vital, thick-skinned, conservative type Lobachevsky links to Eastern European populations, and the so-called jackals, the cold professional killers found among mercenaries and assassins, whom he speculates are rare hybrids of 2 or 3 lesser pathological factors combined. A key point the chapter underlines, and that the reader needs to keep in view, is that all of these deviations together still account for only a small minority of any population. Lobachevsky explicitly warns against the impression that the world is full of deviants. Normal people are the great majority and the real foundation of social life. Power belongs in the hands of normal people. The point of the typology is to identify the small minority whose participation in social processes does damage out of proportion to their numbers, so that normal society can recognize them and protect itself. How pathology spreads through normal people. Before reaching the level of organized groups, Lobachevsky lays out a set of mechanisms by which pathological influence is transmitted through ordinary social interaction. These are the daily building blocks of ponerogenesis. Egotism, in his usage, is the habit of treating one's own instinctive reactions and inherited concepts as the standard by which everything else is measured. Some egotism is normal and even necessary, since it stabilizes the personality. Excessive egotism, especially when it has been picked up through contagion from a hysterical or pathological caretaker, becomes what he calls the king of human faults. The egotist measures other people by his own ruler, treats his own concepts as objective criteria, and tries to force everyone else to feel and think as he does. Whole nations can become egotists in this sense, demanding that other nations think in their categories and go into war over the refusal. Paramoralism is the use of moral language to defend behavior that is not moral. Most paramoralisms feel to the speaker like genuine moral feeling because they ride on the same emotional reflex that real moral judgment uses. The form looks like ethics. The substance is something else, often a rejection of conscience dressed up. Paramoralism is everywhere in human affairs and is one of the main ways pathological motivations get smuggled past normal moral perception. The fact that even decent people slip into it from time to time should not blur the recognition that, in the hands of pathological individuals, it becomes a precision instrument. Reversive blockade is a more specific trick. A skilled pathological speaker insists strongly on the opposite of the truth. The average listener, seeking the reasonable middle, ends up halfway between the truth and its inversion, which is to say, in falsehood. The technique is rarely used by normal people. In the hands of those in power who know what they are doing, it is used with virtuosity. Information selection and substitution describes the unconscious operations by which uncomfortable conclusions get blocked. Premises that lead to such conclusions get repressed, and replacement premises get inserted to deliver more comfortable conclusions instead. The whole package, which Lobachevsky groups under the broader term conversive thinking, is the engine that drives the slide from honest cognition into a comfortable, falsified worldview. Conversive thinking is contagious. Once a community has enough of it, the people who try to maintain ordinary, clear thinking find themselves in a stigmatized minority. Spellbinders. The term Lobachevsky uses for the most influential carriers of pathological worldviews in social life is spellbinder. A spellbinder is a person whose pathological egotism gives him no third option besides forcing other people to share his experience or feeling like a complete misfit. He chooses the first. The pressure that results in him pushes a continual stream of paralogisms, paramoralisms, and reversive blockades out into the surrounding social field. The whole performance is held together by an ideology, partly true, that elevates the spellbinder's experience as superior. Behind the ideology, in his own personality, the same ideology serves to repress the self-criticism that would otherwise destroy him. Spellbinders always find converts, and they are usually surprised that the converts are a minority. In a healthy society, the activities of a spellbinder are recognized and shut down quickly. In a society already softened by hysterical conditions, by social injustice, or by mediocre or pathological leaders, spellbinders can lead millions into catastrophe. The decisive point Lobachevsky wants the reader to internalize is this: a spellbinder is always a pathological individual. Treating his arguments as just one more position in a marketplace of ideas to be answered on their merits misreads the situation. The argument is the symptom, not the substance. Ponerogenic associations. When several pathological individuals come together with a number of normal but susceptible followers and form an organized group, Lobachevsky calls the result a ponerogenic association. He distinguishes two kinds. A primary ponerogenic association is one whose pathological members were active from the start, shaping the group around their own goals. Most criminal gangs are of this kind. Because such groups offend ordinary moral sensibility from the beginning, they tend to stay small and local. They lose their fights with society over the long run. A secondary ponerologic association is far more dangerous. It is a group founded around a real social or political idea with genuine appeal, and originally led by normal people. At some point, under stress or in a moment of moral weakness, pathological factors get inside. Once they are inside, the original ideology is gradually repurposed. The names and symbols of the original cause continue to draw normal members and to provide cover. Underneath, the substance is being replaced. Old acquaintances of the leadership refuse to believe early reports of defamation, much as friends of an individual undergoing personality decay refuse to believe the first reports of his new conduct. By the time the change is undeniable, it is well advanced. The internal evolution of such an association follows a pattern Lobachevsky has observed enough times to describe with some confidence. The early phase is dominated by characteropaths, especially paranoid characteropaths, who provide the inspirational fervor and bind in the followers. There is still a romantic feel to the group at this stage. Then, the more normal members get pushed out into peripheral positions and excluded from inner secrets. Some leave on their own. Inherited deviants, especially essential psychopaths, take over the inner workings, often from the shadows, since a less obviously pathological face is more useful out in front. A new, more vital and ruthless leader frequently arrives later, joining the group only after the ponerization has begun. The original spellbinder accepts a secondary role, since the alternative is being eliminated. From then on, the group has two leaders, whose relationship is one of mutual contempt held together by mutual need. The spellbinder needs the brute to enforce the ideology,
The brute needs the spellbinder to make the ideology continue to sound respectable. The structure inside the mature association is more elaborate. There is a more pathological inner elite who understand the real intentions and the real ideology. There is a more normal outer membership who get the propaganda version. The leadership is not actually autocratic, regardless of what the propaganda says. The figure at the top is closer to an actor with a director, kept in place by a shadow clique that can remove him if he stops serving. Lobachevsky uses Bormann's role around Hitler as the example. The general law, he insists, holds at every social scale, from a small criminal gang to a major political movement. Ideologies as cover. Every ponerogenic association needs an ideology. Even the smallest gang has its melodramatic story about itself. The function of the ideology is to halo behavior that, stripped of the halo, would simply look like cruelty and dysfunction. Anyone who tries to perform that stripping, including a writer like Lobachevsky, is going to provoke fierce resistance, not only from the group itself, but from sympathetic observers whose sense of romance has been invested in the group. The ideology of a secondary ponerogenic association is layered. There is an outer layer, which retains the language and symbols of the original cause and is used for propaganda and for managing less trusted members. There is an inner layer, in which the same words have been redefined to mean something different, and which only initiates can read accurately. Understanding this double talk requires fluency in both languages. The presence of the doubled language is itself a clinical sign that the ponerization process has gone deep. The constant elements across all such ideologies are the same: a wronged group, a radical setting right of the wrong, and the higher value of the people who have joined the cause. These three elements together perform the work of releasing the believer from ordinary moral constraints. Lobachevsky wants one specific point recorded for later use. Ideologies do not need spellbinders. Spellbinders need ideologies. The ideology is a tool. The fact that an ideology has been captured and deformed by a ponerogenic process does not, in itself, discredit whatever truth was contained in its original form. The ponerization process and counter-selection, the transformation of a healthy or partly healthy group into a ponerogenic association, is not a single event. It is a process, and Lobachevsky calls it ponerization. The first observable sign, which he calls the first criterion of ponerology, is the atrophy of the group's normal critical faculties when faced with one of its own pathological members. When a group treats opinions issued by an obviously deviant member as equivalent to those of normal members, the process is already underway. Once the group has absorbed enough pathological influence to start considering its deviants as exceptional or messianic, the pressure on the remaining normal members begins. They feel an increasingly forceful collective opinion bearing down on them, mixed with the paralogisms and paramoralisms they cannot quite refute. For some, this pressure becomes a moral standard they yield to. For others, it becomes psychological terror they cannot endure. The result is what Lobachevsky calls counter-selection. The more normal members leave, often after being treated as traitors, the more deviant outsiders join, recognizing the kind of place this group has become. Over time, the composition of the group is reversed. Once counter-selection has run its course, the group enters a more stable phase that Lobachevsky calls the dissimulative phase. The public face becomes milder again. The ideology continues to recruit. Internally, however, the operating logic is now thoroughly pathological, and the group's outward expansion in this phase can be at its most aggressive. Eventually, the gap between the public face and the internal reality becomes too wide to maintain, and the group's true colors return into view, at which point a healthy society can move against it. The interval between the start of ponerization and that final reveal can be very long. Closing notes on ponerology as a discipline. The chapter ends with a turn back to the question of how this kind of science changes our moral practice. Ponerology does not eliminate the question of human guilt, but it changes the practical importance of moral judgment.
The more carefully we trace the causative processes that condition a person's behavior, the less useful, and perhaps the less possible, it becomes to assign blame in the simple sense. The conscience remains real, and people remain right to judge their own behavior and motivations. The judgment of others, by contrast, becomes increasingly the wrong tool. This may strike some readers as moral indifference. Lobachevsky insists it is not. The shift from judgment to causation analysis is a different and stronger kind of moral seriousness, since it allows for prevention and treatment rather than mere punishment. He notes the convergence with the old teaching from the Christian Bible against judging others, and treats that convergence as a confirmation rather than an embarrassment. The chapter sets up everything that follows. The next chapter applies the framework at full scale to the macrosocial phenomenon Lobachevsky has been pointing toward all along. The political form that ponerogenic associations take when they capture the institutions of an entire state. He calls that form pathocracy. Chapter 5, Pathocracy. This is where the framework built in Chapter 4 gets applied at full scale. When a ponerogenic association captures the institutions of an entire state, Lobachevsky calls the result pathocracy. He adopts the term from a Hungarian scientist who had used it before him. The word is meant to do specific work. It identifies the system not by the ideology it claims to follow, since pathocracies of different stripes look much the same, but by the underlying reality. A small, pathological minority has taken control of a society of normal people. The genesis of primary pathocracy. In a society that is otherwise stable but already softened by hysterical conditions, the seed of a pathocracy is usually planted by a schizoid thinker. The schizoid theorist puts together a doctrine, partly true, that simplifies human nature in the gloomy way the schizoid mind always does, and that recommends a strong power exercised by qualified individuals in the name of a higher idea. The schizoid declaration introduced earlier is built into the theory. The theorist himself is usually not violent. His danger is intellectual. When such a doctrine is widely circulated, ordinary readers respond in 3 different ways. Most either reject it on instinct or read it correctively, taking the partial truths and filling in the schizoid gaps from their own richer psychological worlds. A smaller third group reads it pathologically. These are people with their own deviations, or people genuinely broken by injustice, who absorb the doctrine in its raw form and brutalize it further. Marx's body of work, in Lobachevsky's view, is the textbook 19th century example of how this trifurcation plays out. The same doctrine produces both a humanizing socialist tradition and a homicidal one, depending on who is reading. The next stage is the entry of characteropaths. Paranoid characteropaths, in particular, are spellbinders by nature, and they take the schizoid doctrine and turn it into an active propaganda movement. At this stage, the movement still has a recognizable connection to its original ideology. People still talk about it under its original name. The characteropaths give the doctrine its emotional engine and recruit the early followers, especially young people drawn to fervor. The third stage, which is where pathocracy proper begins, is the entry of essential psychopaths and other inherited deviants into a movement that has now created a pocket of social space where the rules of normal life have been suspended. Psychopaths normally avoid organizations governed by reason and ethical discipline. Once a movement has become a recognizable shelter for people like them, they stream in and attach themselves to it. Pretending to be sincere followers comes naturally. The original characteropaths and ideological true believers are useful to them at first, but expendable later. The decisive moment is what Lobachevsky calls a wholesale showdown. The original ideologists and the characteropath spellbinders are pushed out, exiled, or killed. The figures who survive and rise are the essential psychopaths and their inner circle. From that point on, calling the movement by the name of its founding ideology is a serious analytical mistake. The names and slogans are kept, but the substance is now the pathological minority's own logic, dressed in the old clothes. The mature phenomenon. A pathocracy needs people. To staff its administration, its police, its industries, its army, it needs personalities of its own kind down to the level of village headman and factory floor manager. Inherited pathology of the relevant types accounts for only a very small fraction of any population, perhaps 0.5% for essential psychopathy and a few percent total for all the related conditions. A mature pathocracy ends up using more or less every adult deviant in the country. Given that the typical deviant is also below average in intelligence and skill, no field of public life, whether industry, science, education, or culture, can function normally. Pathocracy paralyzes everything it administers. A consequence follows that pathocrats themselves do not always anticipate. Because they cannot run the country with their own people alone, they must make some accommodation with the society of normal people. They need normal engineers, normal scientists, normal administrators, normal diplomats. Lobachevsky estimates that beyond the active pathological elite of around 6% of the population, another 12% or so are people who have warped themselves to fit. This second group is on average less healthy than the rest of the population, with elevated rates of mental illness and physical fragility, and is held in place partly by genuine convenience and partly by the sense that they belong nowhere else. They become the bridge between the elite and the rest. They take many of the technical and managerial positions because they can both understand the work and speak the elite's language. The total of the active deviants and the warped intermediaries comes to around 18% of the population, and even this figure overstates real conviction. The remaining majority are the society of normal people who have not gone over. Faced with this majority, the pathocrats also have an external problem. The world outside still belongs to systems of normal man. If the pathocracy's true face becomes obvious to that world, recognition could collapse, trade could be cut off, and the regime could fall. The pathocracy therefore enters what Lobachevsky calls the dissimulative phase. The methods of internal terror are softened. Propaganda is given a smoother surface. Some autonomy is allowed in cultural life. Diplomats are recruited from people who can pass for normal in foreign settings. The country's pathological face goes behind a public mask, much as an individual psychopath wears the mask of sanity. The pathocracy in the dissimulative phase is at its most expansionist abroad, because the softer face makes its appeal to people in still healthy countries more effective. Why pathocracies must expand? A pathocracy cannot afford peace. Its survival depends, at every level, on continual outward pressure. Lobachevsky lists the reasons. The first is internal. The pathological elite and its warped supporters can never go back to ordinary life. They lack the practical skills and the temperaments. If the system fell, ordinary courts would not just remove them from office, they would face judgment, often harsh, often as much for what they were as for what they had done. Survival as private citizens is barely an option. The system that rewards them must therefore continue at all costs, and the moral feeling of the elite, such as it is organized around that necessity. The second is demographic. The society of normal people has the higher birth rate, holds the technical skills, and gradually produces sons of pathocratic families who, by genetic accident, did not inherit the disposition. Left undisturbed, the pathocracy's grip would erode imperceptibly but steadily. The elite has to find a way to keep the normal majority distracted, exhausted, and where possible, reduced in number. War, especially war against an obstinate and well-armed opponent, accomplishes much of this at once. It thins the young men of the normal majority, turns them after death into propaganda heroes useful for raising the next generation in pathocratic loyalty, and channels public attention into imperial striving. Pothocrats, Lobachevsky observes in a characteristically cold sentence, do not grieve for their war dead the way kings once did. They considered those soldiers to be not quite of their own species in the first place. Any war waged by a pothocratic state has both an external and an internal front, and the internal front is usually the more important. The third reason is ideological. As long as the world outside contains functioning systems of normal man, the people inside the pathocracy keep watching it, comparing, dreaming. Their attention has to be diverted into imperial striving. The masks of revolutionary mission, of historical destiny, of liberating other peoples from oppression, all serve to redirect that attention outward. The fourth is structural. The legal systems of normal countries are based on assumptions about human nature that pothocracies do not share, and pothocracies can exploit those assumptions at will. The cunning of the pathological mind is greater than the legalistic mind expects. As long as ordinary states keep playing by ordinary rules, they remain at a tactical disadvantage against the pothocratic state across the table. Pothocracy by force and by infection. A primary pathocracy emerges within its own society over time. The other two pathways are shortcuts. One is force. A pathocracy already in existence in one country imposes its system by military occupation on a neighbor whose own internal weaknesses had not yet matured into pathocracy on their own. The imposed system arrives in finished form, skipping the long opening phases that the originating country went through. The schizoid and characteropathic generations are not visible to people on the receiving end because they belong to the originator. What the subjugated country sees is the mature article. The receiving country goes through a brief and dramatic shock. Some people in every social class suddenly seem to flip. Yesterday's Christian or patriot writes today's denunciations. The flip is not as universal as it looks, and within a few years, the society stratifies along very different lines from the political ones it knew before. Imposed pathocracies have one important weakness. They never fully take because the imposed system always feels foreign, and the subjugated nation's older cultural and religious traditions become reservoirs of resistance, often deepening underground rather than dying. Lobachevsky's prediction at the time of writing was that an imposed pathocracy would not survive the fall of its source country by more than a few weeks. History has confirmed this for the Soviet bloc. The third pathway is infection. An existing pathocracy radiates a kind of signal that deviant individuals in other countries can read at a distance. Lobachevsky uses the metaphor of a radio frequency. The signal says, in effect, there is now a place in the world where people like us can rule. The deviants in the target country, who would otherwise be marginal, find themselves sponsored, financed, trained, and pointed at the levers of power. They come bearing imported revolutionary doctrines whose original purpose was different, but whose defamation is now well underway. Around them, a wider circle of recruits forms. Some are spellbinders, rising for their own pathological reasons. Some are mercenaries, paid for the work, whose moral indifference is itself a clinical sign. Some are people with real grievances. Some are simply intellectually unprepared. In a target society that already has serious injustices, an over-egoistical ruling class, or an advanced phase of the hysterical cycle, the infection spreads quickly. Reformers who try to fix the underlying problems are not allowed to succeed, since their success would deny the pathocracy its opening. The most capable reformers are sometimes simply killed. An infected pathocracy, once established, recapitulates the same internal dynamics as a primary one, with one variation. A second purge is required because the transitional leadership of the takeover is rarely loyal enough. After that purge, the infected pathocracy enters its own dissimulative phase. From then on, Only the rise of a coordinated network among the country's normal majority offers any practical hope of reversal. Society under pathocracy. The composition of the society under pathocratic rule deserves to be stated clearly, because it sets up what comes in later chapters. Around 6% of the population is the active pathological elite, with essential psychopathy at the inspirational core and other deviations filling in the supporting ranks. Around 12% is the warped intermediary class, weaker and more sickly than the average, occupying technical and administrative positions and serving as the bridge between the elite and the normal majority. The remaining roughly 82% is the society of normal people, which over time develops an informal communications network of its own, an intuitive psychological immunity, and a private vocabulary for talking about what is actually happening. These divisions cut across formal party membership. Many normal people are forced for circumstantial reasons to join the official party, where they perform the rituals badly and gradually rebuild their links to society. Specially trusted pathocratic figures, on the other hand, do not need party membership at all, since their loyalty is guaranteed by their nature. The pathocratic party itself does not stay unified. From early on, it bifurcates. One wing is the harder, more consistently pathological core. The other is more liberal, in the sense that the original ideology survives there in degraded but recognizable form, and the people in this wing retain some real connection to the society around them. The first major internal crisis tends to come about 10 years after the system's emergence, and it is the liberal wing that creates the opening through which the society of normal people can begin to push back. Closing notes on the nature of the phenomenon. The chapter ends with a methodological warning. Pathocracy is not, properly speaking, a political system at all. It is a macro-social disease. It looks like a political system from the outside because it occupies the institutions of one. Treating it analytically as just another regime, comparable to other regimes in the categories of political science, will miss its essential features. The names, the parties, the official doctrines, the constitutional forms are all stable enough on the surface to invite comparison, but the substance underneath them is changing all the time in ways that follow the laws of a clinical process rather than the laws of politics. The right framework is etiological. A pathocracy goes through identifiable phases. It has a characteristic onset, a violent, active stage, a long dissimulative middle, and a slow terminal decay. It can be diagnosed, and once it is diagnosed accurately, the search for treatment becomes possible. Without an accurate diagnosis, treatment is guesswork. Lobachevsky returns once more to his motto, the Latin medical maxim, "Do not try to cure what you do not understand." The chapters that follow take the framework into specific territory. The next one looks at the inner experience of normal people living under pathocracy, the psychological adjustments they make, and the kind of immunity they slowly develop. After that come shorter chapters on what happens to psychology and psychiatry as professions under such a regime, on the relation between pathocracy and religion, and finally on what therapy for the world might look like. Chapter 6. Normal people under pathocratic rule. This chapter looks at the inner experience of the 80-some% who never go over. It is more personal than the chapters around it, and Lobachevsky draws openly on his own time as a citizen of pathocratic Poland. He opens with a thought experiment. Imagine that Daltonists, people unable to distinguish red from green, have taken over a country, and that they have outlawed any acknowledgement that ripe and unripe tomatoes look different. Inspectors with sidearms patrol the gardens. The citizens dutifully eat green tomatoes and tell each other they are ripe. The moment the inspectors leave, however, the gardeners pick the ones that are actually red, make a salad, and add a few drops of rum for flavor. Lobachevsky suggests that normal people living under pathocracy adopt this salad as a private symbol. The point of the analogy is the underlying impossibility. A daltonist regime cannot, in fact, train people who can see colors to stop seeing them. The pathocratic regime is in much the same position with respect to ordinary human moral perception. It can punish, intimidate, and inundate, but it cannot turn its subjects into people of its own kind. Normal human nature is not erasable by any amount of indoctrination, however sophisticated, however cruel. The pathocrats themselves do not quite believe this. They keep believing that with better methods, better propagandists, better ideological writers, they will finally get the others to think the way they think. The whisper that the project is impossible has to be repressed from the field of pathocratic awareness, because if it were ever fully admitted, the future of the regime would have to be confronted directly, and there is no comfortable place for that confrontation to land. What pathocracy does to normal people. The fact that the project ultimately fails does not mean it does no damage along the way. Personality development under prolonged pathocratic conditions is impoverished. Subtle moral and aesthetic values get crowded out. People who have spent years on the receiving end of pathological behavior absorb the psychological material of the ones who have abused them, the way concentration camp inmates absorb the personalities of their guards. Awareness of this absorption, plus accurate clinical information about what was happening and why, is what makes recovery possible. A person who learns, even years later, that he was on the receiving end of something with a clinical name can begin to throw the borrowed material off and rebuild his sense of the human world. Children growing up entirely under such a regime bear a heavier burden than adults who came to it from a healthier, earlier life. Adolescents, in particular, are exposed at the worst moment, when the personality is still forming. The presence of any decent and normal teachers at this stage matters enormously. A schoolroom with a humane adult in it can repair quite a lot of damage done elsewhere. The first encounter. A normal person who has read about a pathocratic regime from a distance arrives in it confident that he understands what he is about to see. The first weeks dispossess him of that confidence. None of his prior categories explain what he is now living through. He feels intellectually helpless. The worldview he brought with him does not break down so much as become quietly useless. People at this stage divide into two responses. Some accept the disorientation honestly, hold the cognitive void open, and gradually find their footing. Others fill the void with the regime's own propaganda material, which is everywhere and ready to hand. The difference between these two responses is what separates a person who maintains himself and one who undergoes transpersonification. Direct contact with a pathocrat in person is different from anything in the experience of a healthy society. Lobachevsky describes the encounter in clinical terms. A psychopath using practiced techniques to crush a normal person's psyche produces something close to short-term catatonia. The cortex inhibits more strongly than usual. Feelings stifle and then leak out unhelpfully. Associative thinking slows. Self-defense becomes nearly impossible in the moment. Only afterward, in benevolent company and with rest, can the experience be reflected on. Any moralizing judgment of how someone behaved during such an encounter by a person who has never been through one is automatically inaccurate. The mind under that pressure is not the mind that decides what it would like to do. The slow building of practical knowledge, over years and decades, normal people working alongside one another build a body of practical knowledge about pathocracy that no one outside the country can quite share. The knowledge accumulates in evening conversations, in the careful exchange of observations between trusted friends, in jokes. A private vocabulary develops, a kind of insider language, in which the same official words carry quite different meanings than they do in propaganda. The insider language and the official language coexist on the same surface, and an outsider hearing the outer words has no way to decode the inner ones. A noticeable feature of this practical knowledge, once it matures, is that the new social divisions in the country no longer align with the old. The old class system was horizontal. People of similar education or wealth had something in common across other lines. The new division, the one that actually matters under pathocracy, runs vertically. It cuts through every old class, putting pathocrats and their warped servants on one side and the society of normal people, drawn from all walks of life, on the other. A peasant and a professor, formerly very different from each other, now have the most important thing in common. The basis of the division is not talent or learning, it is the underlying psychological constitution. The first to denounce the regime, in Lobachevsky's experience, were often the pre-war communists themselves. Forced to join the pathocratic party after the takeover, they could see better than anyone else that the new system was not their old ideology. Their letters protesting this to their comrades abroad were forwarded by those comrades to the local party, returned to the Polish security police, and the writers paid with prison or with their lives. No social group, he reports, was more closely surveilled. A general superiority of the society of normal people in skill and judgment becomes evident over time. Pathocrats need engineers, scientists, and administrators to run the country, and they cannot produce enough of their own kind to do it. Once a project is finished, the experts are often pushed out and pathocratic managers take over, at which point the project usually starts to decay. The pattern recurs at every level of the economy. Immunization and the two arrests. What also accumulates over years is something Lobachevsky calls immunization. The traumatic experiences that paralyzed people in the early years of a regime, 10 or 20 years on, no longer have the same effect. The same arrogance, the same paramoralism, the same psychological bullying that once produced catatonia now provoke a calm internal response from a person who has seen this performance many times. He recognizes it as the buffoonery it actually is. His answers, when he chooses to give them, are well-timed and often laced with quiet ridicule. When a person can look at suffering and even death with steady attention, the regime's main weapon falls out of its hand. Lobachevsky illustrates this with his own life. When he was first arrested in 1951, force, arrogance, and the standard interrogation techniques broke him almost completely within a few days. His brain stopped working properly. He could not even remember the arrest accurately. Conditions in which he could have defended himself existed, but he was not capable of using them. They did almost anything they wanted to him. In 1968, on his last arrest, he was interrogated by 5 security officers. At a certain moment, having thought through their probable reactions, he let his eyes rest on each of their faces in turn. The chief interrogator asked him what he was thinking, looking at them like that. He answered without fear of consequences. He was wondering, he said, why so many men in their line of work end up in psychiatric hospitals. The interrogators were thrown for a moment. The chief said it was because the work was so terrible. Lobachevsky calmly told him he thought it was the other way around. 3 days later, after a shorter and more respectful interview, he was released. He rode the streetcar home past a park, lay down on his bed, and asked aloud whether God was supposed to be in charge of this world. He had known for some time that perhaps a fifth of secret police personnel ended in psychiatric care, and that their characteristic late-stage condition was a kind of dementia previously seen mostly in old prostitutes. The human nervous system cannot violate its own moral feelings indefinitely without paying for it. The new social bonds. As immunization sets in, a new web of social links grows up among the society of normal people, carrying information, warnings, and assistance across the entire country. The links cross former economic and educational barriers in ways that surprise people from the outside. A peasant, an intellectual, and a factory worker can find a common language because their human nature has refused the same imposition. The social solidarity that emerges, Lobachevsky notes, is stronger and more humane than what he later found in competitive Western societies, where economic differences, no longer suppressed by a shared external threat, produce a different kind of social distance. Cultural and religious life, against the predictions one might make from outside, often deepens rather than declines. The conditions force constant mental effort, which sharpens perception. Censored or underground culture is sometimes more alive than the official culture of freer countries. Religion shifts from tradition and ritual towards something more like a chosen faith, conditioned by reading and reflection and tied directly to the believer's everyday choices. Reading the gospel under pathocratic conditions, Lobachevsky observes, is a different experience from reading it in safety, because the social world it describes resembles one's own much more closely. Forgiveness, as the writer Madame de Staël once put it, is one step beyond understanding. To understand all is to forgive all. What the younger generation loses, the older generation, with healthier experiences to draw on, often grows under these conditions. The younger generation, raised with no other reality to compare to, suffers more. Worldview impoverishes. Personality rigidifies. A constant effort to refute paralogisms and paramoralisms takes time and energy that should have gone into building positive content. Despite a great deal of goodwill, certain pieces of the propaganda anchor in the mind and persist. Emotional life is harder still. To survive, a young person learns to suppress reactions that would draw retaliation. Suppressed feelings then surface later, often delayed and inappropriate to the situation that releases them. A chronic, mild, controlled neurosis becomes the normal state of any healthy person living under such a system, and the more intelligent the person, the more pronounced this state. Western-trained psychotherapists, Lobachevsky notes, are useless in this setting. They have no map for what they are looking at. A psychologist working in a pathocracy must invent operational techniques that are unimaginable to colleagues in free countries. He must work indirectly, with illusions, since he can rarely speak openly about the system itself. But with care, he can still help patients recover the voice of their own instincts and the use of their own judgment. What outsiders need to understand. The chapter closes with a request directed at observers in still healthy countries. The accumulated practical knowledge that normal people develop under pathocracy cannot be transmitted by journalism or fiction. No outside writer can reproduce it. What can be transmitted, however, in both directions, is an objective scientific language for the underlying phenomenon. That language is what Lobachevsky has been trying to construct in this book. It can be learned by people without first-hand experience. It can also be sent back into people who have first-hand experience but have been working without conceptual tools. His final request is one of restraint. People living through pathocracy will eventually emerge from it. When they do, observers from free countries will often feel an urge to interpret them in Western political categories, or to sponsor the imposition of Western economic systems on their countries before those systems have any historically conditioned soil to grow in. Lobachevsky warns against both moves. The protest of normal people against pathocracy comes from much deeper than any ideology, and what they will need most when they emerge is not to be told what to think next. They need to be welcomed with human solidarity, mutual respect, and a working trust in their own reason. Chapter 7. Psychology and Psychiatry Under Pathocratic Rule. Lobachevsky opens this short chapter with a question Western leftists kept asking him after he reached the United States. They had been told that in countries calling themselves communist,
the mental health professions would be especially well supported, since serving the working person would naturally include serving people with personal and psychological difficulties. When he told them the actual situation was the opposite, they refused to believe him. What, they asked, could politics possibly have to do with psychiatry? The answer, given the framework already developed in this book, is direct. Politics has everything to do with psychiatry under a pathocracy, because psychiatry is the science most capable of recognizing the regime for what it is, the threat the sciences pose to pathocracy. Imagine, Lobachevsky says, a pathocratic country in which, by some accident, psychology, psychopathology, and psychiatry were allowed to develop freely. Imagine the textbooks circulated, the foreign literature available, the conferences attended, the talented researchers free to publish. What would happen? Within 10 or 15 years, possibly less, the diagnosis the regime most fears would be in print. Not as accusation, but as clinical description, with statistical data and case studies and analytical depth no individual researcher working alone could ever assemble. Once that diagnosis reached world opinion, the propaganda doctrines used to cover the regime abroad would lose their grip. The pathocracy's expansionist Trojan horse will become useless, since people in the targeted countries would now have a vocabulary for what they were being asked to accept. Domestically, the same vocabulary would harden the immunity of the country's normal majority. The regime's most important psychological weapon, the pathocrate's specialized knowledge of how to work on minds that do not understand him, would lose much of its power. For a pathocracy, in other words, freedom in the psychological sciences is a question of survival. Whatever the cost in scientific stagnation, those sciences must be controlled, degraded, and, where possible, redirected as tools of the regime itself. How the control is organized. The control is run through a department of carefully selected supervisors. Lobachevsky calls it the nameless office. Its members are intelligent in a narrow sense, often capable enough to finish university degrees, sometimes by leaning on examiners for generous evaluations. Their actual psychological talent is below average. What recommends them for the job is not insight, but reliability of a particular kind. Most of them carry psychopathic traits themselves. They are rewarded with academic titles, professional positions, and the privilege of representing their country's scientific community abroad. As specially trusted figures, they may be allowed to skip ordinary party meetings, or even avoid joining the party altogether, which lets them pass for non-partisan when convenient. Foreign foundations, Lobachevsky notes, often hand grants to these people in good faith, believing they are supporting the development of real science behind the Iron Curtain. They are doing the opposite. They are funding the very people whose job is to keep real science from forming and giving them the international standing they need to do that job better. On returning home, the supervisor uses his expanded familiarity with what is being studied abroad to identify which lines of inquiry must now be more aggressively shut down at home. He has the power to grant or deny doctorates, careers, and tenure. Mediocre as a scientist, jealous of the more talented in the way pathocrats are typically jealous of the normal, he uses that power to demote real researchers and elevate followers. What cannot be studied? The most carefully suppressed areas are the ones with the most explanatory power for the phenomenon of pathocracy itself. Depth psychology, the analysis of the human instinctive substratum, is forbidden. This makes sense given the framework in Chapter 2. A regime built on deviations of the instinctive substratum cannot tolerate the open study of what the substratum normally contains. Dream analysis is forbidden. Dreams are one of the best schools for psychological thinking generally, and a society of psychologically literate citizens is exactly what a pathocracy cannot afford. The psychology of mate selection is at best frowned upon. The reasons connect to several uncomfortable truths the regime would rather not have illuminated. The essence of psychopathy itself, of course, may not be researched or taught. Where the topic cannot be avoided entirely,
an officially adopted definition is used. It is constructed deliberately to confuse. It folds together various character disorders that have completely different causes, ensuring that no one trained on the official material can later think clearly about any of them. Lecturers in psychopathology, working psychiatrists, working psychologists, and even some political functionaries with no training in the field are required to memorize it and to use it whenever the topic arises in public. The chapter notes, with some grim admiration, that the official definition is genuinely well crafted as an instrument of obscurity. The fact that the regime knew exactly which definitions to corrupt and which subjects to suppress reveals something about the regime's own self-knowledge. The pathocrats understand, at least intuitively, what would expose them. Studying the prohibited list is itself one path to understanding the underlying phenomenon. A central doctrinal claim, framed as philosophy but actually a psychological assertion, is existence defines consciousness. It contradicts a great deal of evidence about the role of heredity in the formation of human personality and life trajectories. Lecturers may briefly and cautiously refer to studies of identical twins reared apart, but they cannot publish on the topic. Arriving in the United States, Lobachevsky was handed a free newspaper on a Queen Street corner, whose front page carried a flattering portrait of Brezhnev wearing decorations he had not yet earned, and whose back page carried a competent summary of the very twin studies research that could never appear in the country supposedly being praised. Two kinds of specialist. Working under these conditions, professionals divide into two groups. Some become morally derailed. Pressed continuously, they accommodate. Their convictions hollow out. Eventually, they make peace with the deformation of their own field and begin to serve the regime, more or less willingly. Others build a stronger foundation under their feet and accept the difficulty and risks that come with seeking honest knowledge. The motivation of this second group is not initially political. It is professional and ethical. They take up their work in order to help patients who would otherwise be poorly served. The political meaning of their work becomes clear to them only later, often when their skills are needed to protect persecuted patients from the regime itself. Students and young specialists, in the meantime, have to find their own way to the scientific data that has been quietly stripped from the curriculum. Those still unaware that anything has been removed at all become unwitting participants in the science's degradation. The scope of the damage extends far beyond politics. People with ordinary clinical needs receive worse care because their physicians have been trained on a curriculum picked clean of its most useful content. Psychiatry as political weapon. A final consequence follows. In ordinary settings, individuals who insist too aggressively that someone else is psychologically abnormal are often themselves the ones with anomalies. Sound legal practice would, in fact, require psychological assessment of accusers whose claims about the abnormality of others are too persistent or too poorly grounded. The same principle, scaled up, illuminates what happens at the level of the state. A pathocratic regime confronted by a citizen whose internal rebellion he cannot quite hide has a convenient option. It can declare him mentally abnormal and refer him for psychiatric treatment. Once the field of psychiatry has been corrupted in the ways already described, this is administratively easy. A degraded psychiatrist becomes a willing tool. The result is a method of terror, the political abuse of psychiatric diagnosis that even the secret police of the 19th century Russian Empire never devised. The abuse of psychiatry is therefore not an accidental excess of an otherwise serious field. It follows directly from the macrosocial logic of pathocracy itself. The field has to be degraded so it cannot make the diagnosis, and once degraded, it becomes useful for hiding people who might have made it. In every country where this pattern operates, individual people of conscience can be found resisting it from within, often quietly and at considerable cost. The pathocracy senses that the danger to itself only grows as medicine and psychology generally advance, and it therefore stays ideationally alert to that danger. Anyone who knows too much in this area, particularly anyone outside the immediate reach of the regime, becomes a target for whatever charge can be assembled against him, including, in a closing irony, the charge of psychological abnormality. Chapter 8. Pathocracy and Religion. Lobachevsky opens this chapter by stepping back from politics for a moment. He approaches religion not from theology, but from his own working philosophy. Monotheistic faith, to a contemporary thinker, looks like an incomplete induction drawn from what we have learned about the laws governing the physical, biological, and psychological worlds, joined to certain encounters that come to a person through introspection. There is also, he writes, a quiet inner voice that complements or rebukes ordinary cognition, and that phenomenon is as real as anything modern investigative methods have made accessible. As psychological research has improved, the gap between religious perception and naturalistic science has narrowed. The two will eventually meet, and certain divergences will become obvious. Better, he argues, to be ready for that meeting than to fear it. The author was a Christian. He admits that when he began this work, he worried that Ponerology would collide painfully with the older religious tradition. Studying the question against the scriptures, those apprehensions faded. The naturalistic understanding of the genesis of evil that he was developing, he found, mapped onto teachings already present in the Gospels. Far from undermining religious knowledge, the new science seemed to be returning thought to a more original way of perceiving moral reality. What religion provides? Religion, he argues, is an eternal phenomenon in human life. As civilizations mature, monotheistic intuitions tend to surface, often first in mental elites. The march of religious thought through history is a kind of historical law rather than a sequence of accidental discoveries by individuals like Zarathustra or Socrates. Accepting religion's basic truths opens a person to a wider field of cognition. Certain psychological obstacles fall away, self-knowledge deepens, and with it the capacity to understand other people, since one comes to recognize an analogous inner reality in one's neighbor. These values become priceless when a person is forced into hard choices in difficult times. If a complete apprehension of a situation is not available, but one must still find a way through for oneself, one's family, or one's nation, the silent voice within saying, "Don't do this," or "Trust me, do this," is a precious resource. Many righteous people, Lobachevsky writes, hold that religious faith is the sole basis on which a person or nation can survive when threatened by phenomena that do not fit into the natural worldview. He has no quarrel with the basic truth of that conviction. But when this conviction leads to contempt for objective scientific work in the same field and reinforces the egotism of the natural worldview, the people holding it have, perhaps without knowing it, stopped operating in good faith. Why religion alone cannot cure pathocracy? The reason is direct. No major religion identifies the nature of the macro-social pathological phenomenon. None contains the specific clinical knowledge required to understand how it arises and how it spreads. Religion can give the spiritual strength of individuals and societies a sustaining and regenerating power. It is not, however, a specific antibiotic against pathocracy. Treating it as one leaves the disease unaddressed at the level where the disease actually operates. Worse, religious organizations themselves have a long history of contracting and carrying ponerogenic infections of their own. When a religious system has been deformed by such a process at some point in its past, the chronic survivals of that deformation can persist for centuries. Trying to remedy them through philosophical and moral reflection alone runs into the same difficulty that confronts ordinary moralizing under any condition. The methods of natural language thought cannot quite reach the underlying pathological factors. Step-by-step untying of inherited knots, working only with the natural worldview, leads at best to a moralizing interpretation of phenomena that in fact had pathological causes, and at worst, to panic and a retreat to whatever feels safer. Dormant foci of the older disease remain in the organism and can become active again when conditions allow. A naturalistic approach to ponerogenesis, by contrast, can attribute the appropriate share of responsibility to the various pathological factors that participated and lift the burden imposed by the moralizing reading. Objective language is more precise, more economical, and ultimately safer when working on delicate matters of this kind. For a religious tradition that began in genuine gnosis and authentic faith, accepting this new science does no harm. The truth, Lobochesky writes, can endure such a washing in modern detergent. It does not lose its eternal values. It regains its original colors. Religion under pathocracy. When a ponerogenic process captures a secular political movement and turns into a pathocracy, the position of religion changes immediately. Polarization becomes inevitable. The religious organizations of the country must take a critical stance, since their basic teachings cannot be reconciled with the regime's reality. Once they do, the regime turns increasingly intolerant toward them, sometimes to the point of trying to destroy them physically. Where a pathocracy has emerged autonomously within a country, the religious systems of that country bear some responsibility for not having prevented it in time. Religion in any healthy nation has enough influence on social life to oppose the early stages of evil if it acts with courage and clear thinking. When it cannot act, this is usually due either to fragmentation and rivalry between denominations or to internal corruption within the religious system itself. Religious organizations that for generations tolerated and sometimes inadvertently inspired the development of pathocratic conditions have to reckon with that history when the catastrophe finally arrives. Where a pathocracy has been imposed by force from outside, the responsibility of the receiving country's religious system is reduced. In that situation, religion has the morally stronger defensive position. It can accept material losses, retreat into the underground if necessary, and undergo its own recuperative process while doing so. Pathocrats can use brute force to attack religion, but they have great difficulty attacking the substance of religious conviction. Their propaganda tends to be too crude, and the predictable result is the same psychological immunization that builds up in any other domain. A regime resorts to direct destruction of religion only when it senses that religion has already become weak enough to be destroyed. Where multiple denominations have a long history of hostility toward one another, divide and conquer can produce short-term gains, but those gains are usually undone by the unifying pressure of shared persecution. A quiet healing. A counterintuitive process unfolds inside religious denominations under pathocratic pressure. The practical knowledge built up by the society of normal people, plus the psychological immunization that comes with it, begins to flow into the religious organizations themselves. Old deformations within those organizations, surviving from much earlier ponerogenic episodes, start to be treated by the same antibodies that the rest of society is producing. The persecution, in other words, can become the occasion for a quiet purification of the religious tradition. Lobochesky reads this in the light of an old, underrated principle, that the effects of a particular causative chain can carry a teleological meaning of their own. The same suffering that the regime imposes accidentally produces an outcome the regime did not intend. The healing would happen more quickly and more safely if it were accompanied by greater conscious awareness of the nature of the phenomenon being defended against. The clinical understanding helps, even here. It informs better plans of action and accelerates the immunization. A proper division of labor. What Lobochesky hopes for on the far side of these troubles is a clear separation of two domains,
The Church, when freed from emergency obligations, would return to its proper concern, which is the relationship between human beings and God. Resistance to ponerogenic phenomena and their global spread would belong primarily to scientific and political institutions, whose work rests on the naturalistic understanding of evil. The two domains cannot be fully sealed off from each other, because the genesis of evil includes ordinary human moral failings, and overcoming those has been the responsibility of religious associations from the earliest times. Cooperation should be possible without confusion of roles. In some pathocratic countries, religious organizations have been forced to involve themselves heavily in political and even economic matters, both to protect their own existence and to help their members and other suffering citizens. Lobachevsky cautions against letting that emergency posture harden into permanent habit and tradition. When the pathocratic period ends, returning to ordinary government becomes harder if the religious organization has built its identity around political functions it should not have had to take up in the first place. Despite the long history of conflict among religious traditions, there is genuine ground for cooperation among people of goodwill. The conclusions one draws from the Christian Gospels and from the other monotheistic traditions, on one hand, and the conclusions one draws from a ponerological view of the genesis of evil on the other, converge. The faithful of various religions and denominations believe in the same God. They face, at present, the same macro-social pathological phenomenon. That convergence, Lobachevsky writes, is enough to support real cooperation toward outcomes whose value is obvious to everyone serious about either truth. Chapter 9. Therapy for the World. For most of history, medicine treated diseases on the basis of folk knowledge passed down across generations. The treatments were not useless. Many of them helped. But certain diseases stayed beyond reach until naturalistic science arrived, with its insistence on understanding the actual causes of an illness before deciding how to act on it. Once that understanding was in place, what had been impossible became routine. Lobachevsky argues that the human community now stands at a similar crossroads with respect to macro-social evil. The traditional moral framework, however sincerely held, has bounced off the problem of pathocracy the way folk remedies once bounced off infectious disease. What is needed is a new science, organized around the real causes of the phenomenon, with therapeutic methods that follow from that understanding. Military force still has its place, the way a straitjacket has its place in a hospital, but the more skillful the practitioners become, the less often the straitjacket is needed. The chapter argues for two large changes. The first concerns how a society treats pathocrats and their adherents once a regime falls. The second concerns how the surrounding world builds psychological immunity in the meantime. The argument for forgiveness. The recommendation Lobachevsky makes here is one of the most demanding in the book, and it will offend many readers on first hearing. His position is that when a pathocracy collapses, the new society of normal people should not subject the former pathocrats and their warped supporters to ordinary criminal prosecution. They should be forgiven, with limited exceptions for outright sadistic crimes where no plausible claim of impaired judgment can be made. The argument is not sentimental. It rests on what the book has already established. Existing legal codes already recognize, in milder form, the principle Lobachevsky once extended. A defendant whose ability to discern the meaning of his act or to control his behavior was limited by mental illness or psychological deficiency receives a reduced sentence. The current rules, he notes, are a compromise between traditional legal thinking and medical humanism, and they are everywhere outdated, more so in the United States than in Europe. The legislators who drafted them could not have anticipated macro-social pathological phenomena that capture susceptible individuals, exploit their unconscious psychological factors, and pressure them into attitudes they did not choose with full awareness.
If essential psychopathy is nearly 100% predictive of attraction to pathocratic activity, then the question of how penal mitigation should treat such people is no longer a marginal legal issue. It is central. Other inherited anomalies should be treated similarly, to the extent that they too play a primary role in the selection of attitudes. Lobachevsky's standard is consistent. We do not blame people for inheriting Daltonism. We should not blame them for inheriting psychological anomalies of which they had no choice, nor should we blame those whose personalities were damaged by trauma or disease, or those broken by the inhuman pedagogy of pathocratic life itself. In the name of their good and society's good, force may still be needed. Compulsory psychotherapy, supervision, prevention, and care all remain available. What has to go is the language of guilt and blame, because that language, however emotionally satisfying, blocks the more humane and more effective response. The most powerful piece of this argument is practical. Pathocracies survive partly on the implicit threat of legal retaliation if they fall. The pathocratic elite cannot return to ordinary work. Stripped of their positions, they would face prosecution, often harsh. Survival as private citizens is barely an option. As long as that is true, the system that protects them must be defended by every available means, and the elite has no incentive to allow a soft landing. If forgiveness is offered credibly, the calculus changes. The threat that drives the regime's most desperate self-preservation is removed. The transition becomes possible. The Nuremberg-era Lobachevsky argues that the Nuremberg trials, however justified they felt at the time, were a missed opportunity. They could have been used to display the entire psychopology of the Nazi system in front of the world, with the Führer himself at the head of the clinical exhibit. Such a display would have led to a faster and deeper unwinding of the Nazi tradition in Germany, reinforced the psychological recovery of Germans and the wider world, and set a precedent for handling other pathocracies clinically rather than vindictively. What happened instead was that psychiatrists and psychologists were swept up in their own emotions and the political pressures of the moment. Several famous individuals with clear pathological features were hanged or imprisoned. Along with them went much of the data that could have built the case Lobachevsky is trying to build. He notes dryly that this is exactly the result a pathocratic would prefer, and that subsequent pathocracies have been spared the diagnosis they should already have been given. Repeating the Nuremberg era in any future reckoning would strengthen, not weaken, the underlying disease. Vindictive justice here prolongs the very condition it pretends to punish. The practical consequences. The proposal, therefore, is this: a new body of law, grounded in the best available understanding of macrosocial pathological phenomena, should limit the criminal responsibility of pathocrats to clear cases of sadistic excess, where impaired judgment cannot plausibly be claimed. The rest should be granted what Lobachevsky calls an unprecedented act of mercy. Some of those affected will need ongoing assistance. People who have lost the ability to adapt to ordinary work will require tolerable living conditions and help in relearning how to live. The cost will probably be lower than any alternative arrangement. The act of forgiveness should be prepared in advance, morally, legally, and organizationally, and the promises made to former pathocrats during a transition should be kept with the honesty befitting a society of normal people. The proposal is bound to offend political emigres who have spent decades accumulating well-earned grievances. Their moral indignation is understandable. Lobachevsky's response is that the standard of judgment they bring to the question is the same standard that produced Nuremberg, and that the same standard, applied again, will produce the same waste. He argues that such an act of mercy, far from contradicting the ancient moral teachings of the major religions, actually expresses them more accurately than vindictive justice does. Only an act of this size, he writes, can break the long chain of ponerogenic cycles and open the door to legal methods organized around the real causes of evil. Recovering captured ideologies. The second therapeutic task, concerns the ideologies that pathocracies use as cover. The book has already argued that an ideology captured by a ponerogenic process is not the same as the ideology in its original form. A psychotherapist treating a recovered patient does not throw away everything the patient believed during his illness. He searches for the original, more sensible content of those beliefs, the kernel that the disease deformed, and helps the patient build a bridge over the period of madness back to a healthy reality. The same approach is needed at societal scale. The deformed ideological systems pathocracies leave behind have an original content that predates the infection, plus reasonable elements that emerged later despite the infection. Recovered carefully, that content can resume natural development. Once recovered, however, the ideology loses its usefulness as a cover for pathocracy and a shield against ordinary, common-sense criticism. This work cannot be done with healthy common sense alone. The phenomenon was produced by a macrosocial pathological process that cannot be measured within the natural structure of concepts. Psychological objectivity, adequate knowledge of psychopathology, and the framework developed in this book are required. Names matter, especially here. Pathocracies generate suggestive labels designed to divert attention from a phenomenon's actual qualities, and a person who has been caught by such a label even once partly loses the ability to think about that subject clearly. Only names with a historical tradition reaching back to pre-infection times should be trusted, and where new names are needed, they should be coined with semantic discipline. As the labels spread, they take the labeling monopoly out of pathocratic hands. The predictable outrage from those quarters will be a sign that the work is succeeding. Immunization. The third task is psychological immunization. Many infectious diseases produce a natural immunity in the people who survive them. Modern medicine imitates that biological mechanism with vaccines, allowing immunity to develop without going through the disease. Psychotherapy uses the same logic on the level of individual experience, helping patients build resistance to traumatizing factors that cannot easily be removed from their lives. Societies that have lived for years under pathocratic rule develop a natural immunity of their own, accompanied by detached observation and that characteristic sardonic humor. The immunity is to the underlying phenomenon, not to any particular ideology, which is why it transfers across regimes, regardless of the ideological mask. The psychological experience teaches the same recognition each time. Properly run psychotherapy on individuals who have suffered under pathocracy improves on the natural process, making the patient aware of the pathological qualities of what he was exposed to gives him a critical distance and a serenity that natural immunity on its own does not produce. The result is better than nature's version, more effective at protecting the patient from chronic neurotic tension, and more useful in everyday life. Awareness of the biological essence of the phenomenon places the patient above it, with a quiet kind of mastery over the people who lack such awareness. This kind of immunity can also be transmitted. Natural immunity tends to fade with the generation that produced it. Scientifically based immunity, organized around clear concepts that can be taught, can be passed to people who have not had direct experience. That portability is what makes therapeutic action at the world scale conceivable. Two related goals follow. In countries already affected by pathocracy, the existing natural immunity should be transformed into the better quality scientific version, easing operations and lowering psychological tensions. In countries showing immunodiversity and exposed to pathocratic expansion, artificial immunity should be developed in advance. The process of acquiring the new awareness is not painless. Stripping the protective mask from a familiar reality produces a stormy period of internal protest, a kind of substitute disease, which is short-lived. Within a relatively short time, the process begins to protect the individual and the society from the poneresic activities mobilized at them. The immunity it leaves behind is colored by a feeling of proper knowledge,
and it creates a new human network among those who share it. Lobachevsky considers this immunity a precondition for any successful political action by the society of normal people. Without it, no real cooperation is possible between free countries and nations suffering under pathocratic rule. Political doctrines based on the natural imagination of people who lack both the practical experience and the naturalistic understanding cannot guarantee a common language. A closing image. The most modern and expensive weapons threatening humanity with global catastrophe, Lobachevsky writes, are obsolete the day they are produced. They are the weapons of a war that must never take place, and the nations of the world pray it never does. International reason has to prevail, reinforced by the newly recovered moral values and the naturalistic science of the genesis of evil. The new weapon Lobachevsky proposes kills no one. It can stifle the genesis of evil within a person and activate his own curative powers. If societies come to understand the pathological nature of evil as it actually operates, they can act in concert on both moral and naturalistic grounds. This would be the most humane weapon ever introduced into human affairs, and the only one that can be used safely and effectively. With it, the long chain of warfare among nations may finally be broken.